looks like we're going to have most of our viewers be online today, but I'd like to welcome those who are here, and we're delighted that you could join us in person. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. We are able to do this because we are in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland. So we're grateful that the college supports us in this way. And at the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Baha'i Chair, and our graduate assistant, Ms. Stella Hudson, for really making this event today possible. They do a lot of work which many of us don't see what they're up to, but they are always busy in the background, so we are grateful to them. So it's my pleasure to introduce today our speaker, and I'd like to welcome her to the University of Maryland, Professor Manon Garcia. And in a minute, I'll introduce her formally, but I want to just say that with her talk today, she is presenting on a subject which the Baha'i Chair is keenly interested in its ongoing engagement regarding with the issue of the equality of women. This is one of the 5 themes of engagement that we examine here at the Baha'i Chair. The others are systemic racism and the root causes of prejudice, human nature, of course the equality of women, frontiers of global governance and leadership, and the last one, overcoming the challenges of globalization of the environment or climate change. But without a doubt, the equality of women stands out as one of the critical issues that really must be corrected if we are ever going to achieve a peaceful world, a world in which half of the world is equally represented in all the various arenas of society and the world. So today, Professor Garcia brings us a timely topic to us. And as we watch the spasm of uprising and protest in one Middle Eastern country, as we watch the images on TV, as we watch on our social media, the images of the Iranian women who are bold and courageous and fighting for their basic rights, we are ever mindful of how important the topic that Professor Garcia is going to talk about today is, and that we are mindful and reminded of the spirit of women, that though it be momentarily quashed, that women can never permanently be held down. And that's my very strong opinion. And as I watch these images, not only of the Iranian women, but in particular, but also around the world, women who are struggling, I think this is becoming more and more apparent. So let me turn now to introducing our great speaker, because what she's going to do for us today, I have no idea what she's going to do, but I'm assuming she'll talk about hierarchies and difficulties which women have trying to live a life in this world. She teaches philosophy at the Free University in Berlin, trained as a philosopher in France. She taught philosophy at the University of Chicago, at Harvard, and Yale, and then she moved to Berlin. She is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and the author of We Are Not Born Submissive, How Patriarchy Shapes Women's Lives. Excellent book, highly recommended. And she just finished a new book. Well, she wrote it in French. It's called Consent in English. It's being translated into English. And this book, her second book, received the award of the best philosophy book published in France in 2022. Now, if you know anything about philosophy in France, that is not an easy feat, because philosophers in France are among the most intellectual, hardcore. So this award says everything about Professor Garcia's work. And with that, I just tell you that the title of her talk is Experiencing Men's World, and I'd like to welcome her. We are delighted to have her with us. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for being here today, in person or virtually. And thank you for inviting me, Professor Mahmoudi. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful that some people take the time to read outside of their very narrow field of expertise, and yeah, I was very touched. Thank you, Kate Seaman, for your continuous help and for making this possible. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so thank you very much. Before I start, I would like to say a few words about the situation in Iran. I am very far from being a specialist, very far. Yet when Professor Mahmoudi wrote to me to invite me to come present my work, I was immediately struck by the fact she holds the Bahá'í chair for world peace. Indeed, many years ago, during my first stay in the US, I made a very dear Iranian friend who introduced me to the Bahá'í faith and to the persecutions that Baha'is have suffered in Iran. Spending time with him and with his friends taught me a lot about faith, about human existence, and a lot about Iran. So I was moved to come talk about my work here in the context of this chair. But I didn't know that the current events would resonate so strongly with my talk in a certain way, to such an extent that my work and my words feel very superfluous to me today. What can I say about experiencing men's world that is not already displayed in such an atrocious way in the few images and reports that we're getting from Iran? I'm still going to try to say a few things that I learned in my research, but even though it doesn't mean much, I want to dedicate this talk to Mahsa Amini, the people who died in the last few days, and more generally, all the women and the people in Iran who are fighting for their freedom. So now, let's get to the talk itself. Experiencing men's world. It's a bit of a weird formulation, but it was interesting for me because Professor Mahmoudi asked me, okay, like, can you present something about your work and gender hierarchy and how they shape women's experiences? And I thought it's interesting because that's actually what I work on, but that's not how I thought about it. I didn't think about the term experience, what it is to experience a certain thing. So what do I mean by experiencing men's world exactly? Why not a man's world? Are we really talking about men's world? Is it really men's world? Well, there are women here. We live the world just as much. So first, I have to narrow the scope of my talk because initially I was interested in talking about experiencing men's world for both men, women, non-binary people. And then I decided that I wanted to focus on what it is to experience men's world as a non-man. And more specifically, we can talk in the Q&A about why I made that choice as a woman. So I understand woman here, not biologically, but socially as any person who passes as a woman, who experiences the world socially as a woman, whether or not they've always experienced it that way. So when I say men's world, I don't mean that the world belongs to men, that it is their property. And I also don't want it to be seen as meaning that any man has the same experience of the world, because actually they do not. Men who are white, privileged, cisgender, live in a very different world than men who are not. And what I mean by men's world here, in a way, is pretty broad and narrow at the same time, so I'll explain. I mean what it is to experience the world in which being a man is considered the norm. And of course, again, keep in mind that what is considered the norm is not just being a man, is being a Western white man, that has purchase power. So we could talk about that more, but still. So to understand better what I mean, I think it's interesting to look at what Simone de Beauvoir does in the introduction of The Second Sex. At the very beginning, she starts with the big question, what is a woman? And she says the following: it is significant that I pose it, meaning this question, what is a woman? It would never occur to a man to write a book on the singular situation of males in humanity. If I want to define myself, I first have to say I am a woman. All other assertions will arise from this basic truth. A man never begins by positing himself as an individual of a certain sex. That he is a man is obvious. The categories masculine and feminine appear as symmetrical in a formal way on town hall records or identification papers. The relation of the two sexes is not that of two electrical poles. The man represents both the positive and the neuter to such an extent that in French, homme designates human beings in general, meaning human beings in general. The particular meaning of the word vir in Latin being assimilated into the general meaning of the word in Latin again, homo. Woman is the negative to such a point that any determination is imputed to her as a limitation without reciprocity. So as Professor Mahmoudi mentioned to me earlier, Beauvoir is not always very easy to understand. But why does this text matter to us here? What is it? What is she doing? It matters to us because it is, to my knowledge, the first time that this idea that man is not only positive or a pole between men and women, but also neutral by opposition to women understood as negative, the first time that this idea is brought up. So what does it mean? It means that it's not like saying tea or coffee, right? When we say man or woman, we have implicitly this sort of idea of Adam. Adam is the human being, and Eve is what Adam is not. And women are what men are not. They're a negative, or they're an extra qualification. So that's why, according to Beauvoir, men would never wonder what it is to be a man. It's because for them, what it is to be them is what it is to be a human. But women are the thing that being a human can be that is not normal in a certain way. So what she means here when she says it's not symmetrical like it looks like on identification papers, it's not like two electrical poles because men are the positive and the neutral or the neutral, is that when we think human being, we think man. And so this is also what it means to say experiencing men's world. There is this book of Criado Perez that I saw, so she's this UK journalist who showed how everything in the world is tailored to men. Seat belts in cars are tailored to men. They don't allow for boobs. Fireman suits are tailored to men. All the crash tests for cars are done only with mannequins that represent men. If you're pregnant, for instance, the seat belts are a catastrophe, but it's not even occurred to them. The NASA, I don't know if you remember, there was this anecdote where there was supposed to be this first woman sent to space, but they figured out that actually they couldn't be sent to space because they didn't have the right suits. It was not fitting them, you know, like they were made for men. So this is what it is to experience men's world, is to experience a world where the basic human being is a man. Another anecdote that you may have heard of that is interesting, now you have the anecdote about selfies, that the size of phones and the length of arm that is planned to make a selfie is the average arm length of a man and the average hand size of a man. Or another thing that people talk about in Germany a lot is that we hear that the actual good room temp to work and to not spend too much energy is 19 degrees. But it's only for men. For women, it's 21. In Celsius, sorry, not in Fahrenheit. But all these kind of things, right? And this is what Beauvoir is already talking about. So what Beauvoir is saying is that when we think human, we inadvertently think man. That we think of woman as a difference, as a divergence from the norm that man is. Again, it doesn't mean that all men are the norm, as man is most of the time implicitly white, privileged, etc., as I said. So we also saw this when they realized that the face ID function of iPhones could not work for Black people. It hadn't occurred to them that, like, people could also not be white, right? So it's the same sort of idea. But what this quote is also telling is something else. It tells us that men are not interested in what it is to be a man, nor in what it is to be a woman. And so that's what is very strong with the second sex, is that in 1949, it's the first time that a philosopher says, okay, what is it metaphysically to be a woman or to be a man? Because actually, in saying this, Beauvoir starts what will become the masculinity studies. She is the first philosopher to ask what it is to be a man specifically, that is not to be a human being. So that's also interesting to see how feminism is the way into interrogating what is the masculinity, virility, manhood, etc. So it's not that men consciously don't want to know anything about it. Rather, they don't know to wonder about it. They don't see that their world is men's world. In a certain way, the first immediate aspect of experiencing men's world is to experience it as men's world, is to experience what it is to live in a world, and to live in a world, one could say, in which one is not being the normal, neutral being. So for men, of course, so I think it's one of the very interesting lessons of the knowingly obscure philosopher Heidegger, where he shows that we don't question ourselves about the world until the world resists us, until it doesn't work. And so, of course, men don't wonder what it is to experience men's world, because men's world doesn't resist to them. So there is a positionality that makes us ask these questions. So now that we have a better sense of what I mean by men's world, let's go back to what I was saying. When I briefly talked about Iran earlier, I said that one could say that what is going on in Iran is one of the most violent, most cruel ways of experiencing men's world. In that context, experiencing men's world is experiencing men's power and men's desire for destruction. For women in Iran right now, experiencing men's world means having to fight for their survival. I'm not going to argue that women in the West, understood broadly as North America, Western Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, experience anything like women in Iran. But I want to argue that there is a continuum between these situations, and that this continuum is patriarchy. So feminisms are multiple, yet all of them have in common to conceive of society as being organized by what they call gender. The gendered social organization entails that women or men are educated, incentivized, and asked to behave differently from each other. And as a consequence, women's experiences are deeply shaped by gender hierarchies and in many ways differ from men's experiences. One of the commitments of philosophy is to seek to analyze humans' lived experience, yet only few philosophers have endeavored to study how gender hierarchies shape women's experiences. So in this talk, I want to argue that experiencing men's world as a woman is experiencing the world as being for others, and especially as being for men, and that such an experience severely limits the possibilities for women's flourishing. So the first thing that is a bit puzzling is, what does it mean being for others? So again, is it not like this sort of lingo of existentialism? So when I quoted French philosopher and feminist extraordinaire Beauvoir, some of you may have thought immediately, like intuitively, of her lifelong companion, Jean-Paul Sartre. And indeed, for many people, especially in France, Beauvoir, although she's written dozens of novels, 7 tomes of memoirs, many philosophy texts, and The Second Sex, which is probably the philosophical bestseller of the 20th century, on top of being the Bible of the feminist movement, although she was a very famous author, Beauvoir is most of the time introduced through her companionship or love life with Jean-Paul Sartre. This anecdote gives us a glimpse into one of the core arguments of the talk today. Even someone as accomplished, as empowered to take the theme of this lecture series as Simone de Beauvoir, was and still often presented as secondary, as for Sartre. She's the one who helped him, who made his views known, who wrote papers against his detractors. She was for him. What does that mean? Sartre and Beauvoir, and that's the main reason why I was giving you this anecdote about who her partner was, were 2 core figures of a philosophical commitment of the 20th century called existentialism. One of their core idea, as their name indicates, is human existence, and the idea that humans are these beings for whom existence precedes essence. What does it mean, existence precedes essence? Well, what they're saying is that you have things like chairs, like paper cutters. A chair is nothing else than a thing that allows us to sit. A paper cutter is the fact that it cuts papers. But a human being is more than what they function as or what they've done in their lives. Professor Mahmoudi is more than just Professor Mahmoudi. That's not enough to say what her essence is. Because what it is to be a human is to be the kind of people who can shape themselves, who have the freedom to make projects, to go where they were not expected, to invent new ways to be. So in a certain way, it's only when we've seen how you've existed, what you've done with this freedom, this existential freedom that was yours, that we can say, well, that's who she or he was. And so Sartre makes a very interesting and useful distinctions. The way he understands how people exist and are is that first, we have a consciousness of ourselves as that is immediate. We don't even think of ourselves as ourselves. We just are. And so when we just are, when we live in the world, we see everything that is not us as objects, meaning as possible obstacles, as possible things we're gonna desire, as possible things we want to do. But we think the world in terms of there's us and there's the rest. And that's the distinction between subjects and objects. And he says, and then what happens is that one day you're in a park or you're living in the world and you see another human being and you see that they're not a normal object. They're not like those chairs and things. You see that there's something about them that makes them analogous to you to such an extent that for them, you're an object. And that you start seeing yourself seen. You're like, oh, wow, you get a consciousness of yourself. So this is something inherited from Hegel, but I won't explain the history of philosophy here. But what is very interesting is that you start seeing yourself as not only for yourself, but also for others. How do you look? How do they perceive you? What do they want from you? Are they going to recognize you as a subject that has freedom, that has projects? And that becomes a source of a lot of anguish, of a lot of anxiety, of a lot of strategies. You want people to see who you are for real, etc. And what is important is that for Sartre, as for many other philosophers before him, we're first a subject, an I, who speaks, wills, experiences the world, and then we can be a him, a her, a them. My main claim is that one of the most important effects of patriarchy is to deprive women of this experience of themselves, first and foremost as subjects. Instead, women are, at every point of their lives, taught to see themselves first as objects. That subjectivity is not something immediate. It's something that you can conquer, but it's not the way you experience the world. You experience, so I'll give more examples, but you see these pictures. When you grow up as a woman, you have this idea of the woman who cleans, the sexual woman, the mother, and all these functions are functions of women doing things for other people. What is interesting here is that it's not about her desire to clean. You see her outfit, right? It's not for herself. I don't know if you've ever cleaned the floor, but this is not a good outfit to clean a floor. Here, what is interesting is how she's interested in his desire. Here, she's cooking for her kids, for her husband. So it's always for something. And so one of the main forms of this being objects is what feminist theorists commonly call sexual objectification. So Catherine McKinnon, I hope you know who Catherine McKinnon is, but if you don't, she's really badass. So Catherine McKinnon is a legal theorist and a law professor who changed our world in a very simple way because she invented sexual harassment. Before her, sexual harassment didn't exist. She made sexual harassment into a law. She did a lot of other things. She's also the one who had international courts recognize rape as a war crime. So she's that level of changing the world person. And in a very famous book that she wrote called Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, she has these two sentences. She's really like, even if you disagree with everything she writes, just read her because she's someone who has style. Like she writes so well. So all women live in sexual objectification the way fish live in water. Given the statistical realities, all women live all the time under the shadow of the threat of sexual abuse. As you can see, it's not really uplifting, but still. So I find this quote very interesting, and I'll get back to it, but this quote is going to lead our way through an analysis of what it is to experience oneself as a sexual object. But I want to go further than McKinnon here and argue that all women live in objectification, period, the way fish live in water. Their, or should I say our objectification is sexual, of course, but not only. But let's take a step back and argue first, like McKinnon, that all women live in sexual objectification the way fish live in water. I.e. that for women, the experience of men's world is the experience of being a sexual object. To show this, I will use the help of Beauvoir. The central role of objectification in Beauvoir's philosophy of the body leads her to distinguish two specifically feminine experiences of the body. First, women's bodies are objectified on a social level to such an extent that this objectification pre-exists the experience that women can have of their own bodies. And secondly, this structural objectification shapes and determines the experience that women can have of their own bodies to the extent that only women have an experience of their lived body as being an object. So the fact that men turn women into objects to be loved, to be sexually consummated, or to be used for free domestic labor impacts the way women live their bodies. The first volume of The Second Sex shows that one of the ways in which men affirm their being subjects is in conceiving women as objects and treating them as such. So it's actually very interesting. So the theory of Beauvoir is that it's really hard to be a subject. And one way to be feeling better about being a subject is to have someone who tells you, you're really a subject and you're doing great. And that the best, the real authentic way to do that is to have friends. But friends means that you need to tell them also that they're doing great. And you need to let them really see you and maybe judge you and maybe disagree with what you are. And that Beauvoir thinks that men have had historically the power to avoid this very difficult thing that is friendship in creating myth about the group of women, in saying, well, they're the people who are not human enough that they need to recognize me, that I need to recognize them when they recognize me, but human enough that it's still cool to be recognized by them. I still feel like a good subject. And so the idea is that men create myths such that women are in a way petrified, really like stones, into being others, into being small objects that are here to be owned, to be possessed, to be not free in the world. And so she has this quote suddenly. Yeah, she has this quote where she says this. She says, woman is the ideal intermediary between nature, that is foreign to man, and the peer who is too identical to him. She pits neither the hostile silence of nature nor the hard demand of a reciprocal recognition against him. By a unique privilege, she is a consciousness, and yet it seems possible to possess her in the flesh. So that's so for instance, she shows through the example of Eve that woman is conceived as naturally submissive, a simple accident. She's inessential. There's something really non-threatening about her. Men, thanks to their social power, manage to make woman an other, that is to say, to treat her as a particular ambiguous being, conscious enough to recognize men as subjects, and similar to an object in their bodies. In that way, according to Beauvoir, male domination consists in assigning to women the destiny of being the type of being whose body is an object, and therefore whose body is flesh. An extreme example of this phenomenon that comes immediately to mind, and that was very important for McKinnon, is the way in which the cinematography of pornography means to show women's bodies as many organs to be used and holes to be penetrated. I think even these pictures that are a bit softer than porn show you this. Do you really need to have a half-naked woman to sell deodorant, to sell perfume? Why do you need, what is there about women's bodies that make you able to sell shelves, to sell deodorant, to sell hamburgers, to sell cars, to sell AC units? You can name it. Everything you can sell, a naked woman can do. Why is that? So, because the objectification of women's bodies is inscribed in the social structure, it pre-exists the experience that any woman can have of their own body. In that sense, it shows that the women have an objectified body before they learn to have their bodies as themselves. So Beauvoir makes this claim very clearly and in a sense very movingly, I think, in her analysis of puberty at the beginning of the second volume of The Second Sex. According to her, puberty happens when the girl's body becomes flesh. This transformation is obviously a transformation of her physical body. She gets to have hips, to have breasts, etc. But the detailed description that she gives at the end of the first chapter argues that puberty is a transition from one lived body to another, and that this transition happens through the awareness of her body as an objectified one. So I'm quoting Beauvoir, under her sweater, under her blouse, her breasts are spreading, and this body that the little girl identifies with self appears to her as flesh. It is an object that others look at and see. And she describes, it's very interesting because actually there's a British sociologist that showed that this is still an experience that almost all teenage girls experience. That what it is to become a teenage girl is the first time your weird uncle says, "Oh, these titties are growing, huh?" Or someone in the street mentions something about your body, like you're suddenly sexually harassed. And Beauvoir describes in so fantastic details how there's a sort of divide that happens in the relationship of women and their bodies. Suddenly, these breasts, these hips, this body is not yours. And very often what happens is that it happens before women have sexual desire and sexual awareness of their body. So it is that suddenly you're like, what is it about my body that makes people be so weird? That makes people tell me that I need to cover up. And so she describes the mothers who say, now we're gonna need to buy you new clothes. And we could talk about that with the veil as well, right? Like, this is the time where you start needing to wear a veil, or this whole thing about wearing bikinis, you know? Well, now I discovered now that I have kids that little girls are supposed to wear bikinis from the moment they're born, even if there's nothing to hide, but it's still to signal that they're girls, that they will have breasts. But this sort of thing of like, oh yeah, suddenly women start talking to you, they say in a family, like, beware with uncle, whatever. It's better if you don't sit next to him at the table, he can be touchy. So all this new experience of the world makes women feel alienated to themselves and make them feel like their body is for other people before being for themselves. And so becoming flesh for women happens, or for girls, happens through the terrible shock that constitutes for them the discovery that they're being looked at. Beauvoir quotes a woman who says, in recounting her first experience of a comment on her body in the street when she was 13, "I will never forget the shock I suddenly felt in seeing myself seen." From puberty on, women will experience a body that is objectified before it can be a body for myself. In public spaces, in the street, but also in family interactions, the girl will suddenly understand that her body is sexualized by men's look. While until then she was not catching anyone's eye, she then sees herself seen, examined, desire. In a certain way, she will have to realize that with puberty, her body has become something that does not belong to her anymore, that is not her anymore, but a woman's body that is, in men's eyes, an object of desire and possibly an object of consumption. This experience of femininity is very common, and puberty is still lived as a transition from body to flesh, through which the girl becomes aware that her body is not primarily her body. So I want to say that this is a form of this being for others. Like, your body is not for you. It is for other people to look at it. But it is not just women's bodies that are objectified. It's also their lives. Women's bodies are for men just as much as women's lives are for men. Here, I want to take a quick break because I imagine that some of you think, hold on, this is not true. She's being unreasonable. I mean, I myself wonder, is it really true? Am I really for men? Do I really think that women's lives are for men? I guess the response to this question depends on what I really mean by that. I don't think that my life, for instance, is for men or for anyone, although maybe for my kids to a certain extent, but I'll get back to this in a minute. As a white, privileged, cis, straight woman, I'm given a lot of latitude to decide who I want to be and what I want to do. Yet, of course there is a yet. Yet my experience is constantly shaped and organized with reference to an ideal of femininity that is an ideal of being for others. For instance, I'm here talking to you in the context of an important lecture series organized in an important chair in a big university. Surely I feel like an accomplished subject. But that's not all there is, if at all. I also thought, should I really go there? What will my kids think? They will miss me. Then I thought, my husband is so nice to let me go to the US to give talks. I'm a lucky woman. I will need to make sure to make it up for it, to make it up to him. I also wondered if I should make food for him and the kids and freeze it before I left. Usually I do, actually. But this time my mother-in-law will come and feed them. Mind you, my husband can and does cook, but I was very relieved that my mother-in-law will cook for him. I also heard the voices of women from my family whispering to my ear that maybe it was emasculating for my husband to stay with the kids while I was going on a trip to give lectures, and that maybe he would cheat on me. Should I not ask the babysitter to come help him then? She's younger and probably sexier than me, given her youth and all the things about which she doesn't need to worry. Then the boxes from my move were supposed to arrive months ago and haven't. So all my dressy clothes were in those boxes, and I thought, what are they going to think if I don't look super professional? Already I'm talking about feminism, so probably I shouldn't make it worse by looking too casual. I thought, at least I need to do my nails before I leave. But I was like, well, I'm gonna be gone for a long time, so I need to get gel nails. But then I didn't have the time, and I thought, what am I gonna do, you know? Well, hopefully the good thing is I'm gonna be staying in a hotel, so they will have like things to do my hair properly. I spent almost a whole day, a day with daycare, buying clothes, and feeling like I didn't have the right slim toned body to look profesh. Then I received a confirmation of the time of the talk, and I was very relieved. I will have time to FaceTime my kids before their bedtime. There's a way to look at all of this as me being weird and just as the way that I have responsibilities. But I want to argue that it's not an individual idiosyncratic stream of thoughts, nor an experience shared by anyone, by everyone. For instance, I think it's very different because it also occurred to me, although I'm really not scared of flying, but since I've been a mother, sometimes I think, oh, what would happen if I were to die, you know? So that's I think, a very common anxiety that you can have. Oh, should I really take this trip? What if I die in a car accident? I could have stayed and not risked this, and my kids won't have a parent anymore. But actually, the rest of the thoughts that I gave you are very gendered. As far as I can remember, I have never heard any of my male colleagues, nor read any of the male writers I read, talk about their appearance or their parental duties and how they may come in the way of work, in the way of events that are important for their careers. But I do remember reading, for instance, about Deirdre Baer, who's a fantastic writer who wrote biographies of French writers, including Beauvoir, and how she made sure, before each of the trips she made to France for research, to cook enough meals, the exact number of meals for all the days she would be gone, including a pie a day. So she had this massive, she lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and she had this massive freezer, and she would never leave for more than what the freezer could handle. So she would cook 35 meals for 35 days to make sure that her husband and her kids would be fed during her research. This is to say that women are taught to experience themselves not only for others in the sense that they are to be sexually owned by men, but also in the sense that their existences are owned by men. To put it in more agreeable terms, women are taught that men are entitled to them. Kate Mann, who teaches philosophy at Cornell, showed it in her last book, accurately entitled, How Male Privilege Hurts Women. The chapters of the book are a list of men's entitlement, the entitlement to admiration, the entitlement to sex, the entitlement to consent, the entitlement to medical care. Did you know that I think the statistics about medical care is that 70 or 80% of men divorce their wives when she has cancer, when only 3% of women divorce their husbands in similar situations. Entitlement to medical care, the entitlement to bodily control, the entitlement to domestic labor, the entitlement to knowledge. I don't know if you had followed this whole thing about the acknowledgements in books, how back in the day, so now it's changed a bit, but you could look at every acknowledgement of a philosophy book, a sociology book, a history book. It would be like all the things that the guy was grateful for, and at the end it was like, and thank you to Germaine, who did all the archival work and typeset all the things that I've written and also made me meals. She was never, at best, she had a first name, but sometimes it was just, and thank you to my wife, who did all of this for me. And the entitlement to power. So Kate Mann focuses on these many forms, on how these many forms of entitlement hurt women, and I agree with her. But in the context of today's talk, I want to argue that they deeply shape women's experiences. I claim that a good example of that is the expectations that shape the lives of women in traditional marriages, meaning in heterosexual cis marriages with kids, which enact average gender norms regarding the gender division of labor, childcare, femininity. I think the latest figures in US families is that women do 2 hours more of labor at home than men. So the exact things is women aged 15 and older spend 5.7 hours daily doing housework and looking after kids and elders, while men in the same age range do so for 3.6 hours each day. So in average heterosexual married couples with kids, women are expected to do most of the house chores, bear the burden of the mental load of organizing the family's activities, including the social life of the couples, making Christmas cards, buying birthday presents for the kids, but also for the kids' friends, making all the doctor's appointments, care for the kids, care for the elderly parents, but also remain a hot wife, which means buying sexy clothes, monitoring their weight, working out, wearing makeup, doing their hair, their nails, so on and so forth. This has very direct consequences on their experience of the world. Contrary to the description given by Sartre that I summarized for you in the beginning, women do not experience themselves first as for others, and then first as for themselves and then as for others, but the other way around. And there's this very moving quote from Beauvoir, who she says, she talks about a child realizing what domestic labor is. She says, the child thinks of the future as an indefinite ascent towards some unidentified summit. Suddenly in the kitchen, where her mother is washing dishes, the little girl realizes that over the years, every afternoon at the same time, these hands have plunged into greasy water and wiped the china with a rough dish towel. And until death, they will be subjected to these rites: eat, sleep, clean. The years no longer reach toward the sky. They spread out identical and gray as a horizontal tablecloth. Every day looks like the previous one. The present is eternal, useless, and hopeless. So that's pretty depressing quote. But here we see clearly how the experience of being for others has impacts on the very experience of the world. The child's understanding of temporality is itself changed by this experience. Instead of thinking of experiencing the world as there is a future, there's all the things I could do, it's the idea of what my life will be is this constant circle of doing the same again and again, fighting filth again and again. In Beauvoir's words, washing, ironing, sweeping, routing out tufts of dust in the dark places behind the wardrobe, this is holding away death, but also refusing life. For in one movement, time is created and destroyed. The housewife only grasps the negative aspect of it. So there's something that really alters every level of the little girl's experience at this moment. The second aspect is that it does impact how women experience subjectivity. We're here reaching one of the core problems of feminism on which I have devoted my research so far. One of the most difficult obstacles to gender equalities is the ways in which patriarchy shapes women's desires, not just sexually, but in general. Indeed, experiencing men's world consists in experiencing oneself as for others, and the way we experience the world impact what we think we can expect or desire from this world. The economist and philosopher Amartya Sen shows that individuals adapt their preferences and the evaluation of their well-being to the situation in which they find themselves. And he takes this example from women in rural India that he met that knew they had no access to food. In general, there was very little food and very, very little meat. These women convinced themselves that they didn't need to eat, that eating was not something they were interested in. And of course, this is a very dire case, but this is what experiencing men's world does to you. You start thinking, well, actually, I like cleaning. You see it in the reels on Facebook. I saw some today of women making reels about how well they clean their fridge. And I'm like, yes, but you will need to reorganize your fridge after the next time you cook. So this is a thing, this is an eternal redoing of the same thing instead of, I mean, I'm all for cooking, I love cooking, etc. But it is the sort of, if I'm expected to cook anyway, I should as well like it. If I'm expected to be the one who makes the fridge clean and well organized and that this is how I'm going to be judged on my values, maybe this should be my goal in life, to have a very well organized fridge that I can show on the internet. And it sounds like I'm being sarcastic, but I'm not sarcastic. As I want to make clear here, precisely what I want to say is that it is not women's thoughts that they adapt to this, is that they live in men's world. And that living in men's world means that your desires, your prospects of what is doable for you will have an impact, will shape who you are. I have a colleague years ago who did not a sociological analysis, but just asked her students, her undergrads, about how they were thinking about their future family life and their job choices. And the figures were crazy. It was like 95% of her female students had a conversation that week about the compatibility of what they wanted to do in life and their future family life. And only 5% of the male students had ever had a conversation about this. So it was crazy. You could see how, of course, this would enter the way you make choices. Are you gonna embrace a career where you're not gonna be able to be at home at all? Are you gonna go to med school if you know that you're gonna be a resident at the time where you would wanna have kids? My male friends who went to med school, it didn't occur to them when they made those choices. So that's what I wanna say, is that women adapt their preferences. And one aspect of this that I find fascinating and frightening has to do with the second part of Catherine McKinnon quote that I used earlier. As you see, she says, given the statistical realities, all women live all the time under the shadow of the threat of sexual abuse. At first sight, again, this may sound like an exaggeration. Do women really live in fear of sexual abuse at all times? If you think that it is an exaggeration and you're not a woman, ask women around you. Would they change anything in their everyday behavior if they didn't fear sexual abuse? Would they dress differently? Would they travel differently? A few feminist philosophers have worked in the last 40 years on the impacts of sexual violence on women's subjectivity. Their names are Sandra Bartke, Susan Bryson, Anne Cahill, Linda Alcoff, and many others. There are two ideas in their work that I find extremely useful in the context of my argument today. One of them is the idea that women experience themselves as pre-victims. I'll get back on it. And the other is the fact that the prevalence of rape makes women conceive of themselves as somewhat responsible for the assault they may surely be the victim of. Here we see clearly how the experience of being for others has impacts on the very experience of the world. The child, I'm confused, I'm lost, sorry. So the problem of sexual violations is a gender problem in three senses. Sexual violations are almost exclusively committed by men. So experiencing men's world is experiencing a world where men rape. They predominantly target women. And most importantly, they have an effect on all women, not just those who are victims. Indeed, and this is where the problem of rape is a problem for women specifically, although other men and children are also victims of rape. The threat of rape shapes the lives of all women and produces injustices for all women. As philosopher Anne Cahill shows, the threat of rape makes women by default in a pre-victim situation that shapes what they do and what they can desire. Cahill describes this phenomenon by pointing out that women are raised to know that they're in perpetual danger of being sexually attacked and that they must constantly adapt their behavior to this threat, whether it is going out alone at night, not getting on an empty subway train, not meeting the gaze of a man they pass on a deserted street, not traveling alone, etc. I'm citing Anne Cahill in her book, Rethinking Rape. The woman experiences her own individual body as culpable for producing all these dangers. It appears that the feminine body is not essentially weak, sorry, it was an A, but also somehow accountable for its own vulnerability. The feminine body that Young and Bartke describe is that of a pre-victim. If it attempts something beyond its highly limited capacities, if it wanders beyond its safety zone, it, by virtue of its own characteristics, can expect to be hurt. The woman who experiences her body in this way does not locate the dangers presented to her body as originating from outside her body. Rather, they have as their source the fact and nature of her body itself. If that body is hurt or violated, the blame must rest on the woman's failure to sufficiently limit its movement. You see this very clearly, in all the discussions about Me Too. Well, maybe they shouldn't have gone to his hotel room, and maybe they shouldn't have dressed so sexy, maybe they shouldn't have done this or that. It's always women's fault. The constitution of the feminine body is something that is alien to the female subject. The threat of rape shapes women's bodily habits, their movements. Women's lived experience is the experience of knowing they are rapeable and in a way expecting rape. The philosopher Susan Bryson, in her remarkable book about her own experience of rape and post-rape entitled Aftermath, mentions in this regard this thought that runs through her at the time of her rape. This was what I was warned against since childhood. Not only does rape harm the woman who experiences it, but by passing through women's lives as the danger they must prepare for, eventually resign themselves to, as an experience that risks destroying them and stigmatizing them socially, if one holds to the received idea that one could not rebuild oneself after a rape, it harms all women. So experiencing men's world is experiencing oneself as a rapeable body, as someone who's responsible for having a rapeable body, and as being limited constantly by this danger. So we've seen how women's experience of men's world is the experience of being for others, and that this experience is so alienating that it makes them feel at fault for the harms they receive. Now, what are the consequences of this? The first consequence is that women can choose to submit to men and thereby perpetuate women's oppression, even though they have no interest in that. So this is one of the themes of my book that Professor Mahmoudi talked to you. And also that it is very hard for women to know what they really want. And this is, I think, something that we need to talk about in the context of sexual consent. Because I'm all for the only yes means yes view of consent. But the question is, what do women want? And do women know what they want? And do women know what they want to say yes to? Because how do we expect women to say yes to also say no if they are trained to think they live in a world where they are sexual objects, where men can exert violence at any point, where their body is a rapeable body that is their responsibility in case it gets raped? Like, how do we think that these are the conditions for an empowering sexual experience where women can enthusiastically say yes? What do you enthusiastically say yes in this context? So I don't want to end this talk in a very dark way, although it sounds very dark. I'm sorry about that. But I think it's very important to think about these issues in terms of what does it do to women that the world in which we live is seen as men's world. I think this means, especially, that we can't count only on individual empowerment. You can be empowered all you want. You can feel like you're the kind of woman who says yes, or you're the kind of woman who doesn't say yes. But the reality is that your whole experience is shaped by the fact that we live in a man's world, and that this has impact on how you say yes or you say no. And there's this extraordinary book by Nicola Gavey about called the Cultural Scaffolding of Rape, which is a psychologist. And she mentions an interview in which a woman told her, "Why can't I say no? I have found it very difficult in the past to say no to a man who wants to sleep with me. Very difficult, nearly impossible, in fact." And Gavey eliminates this difficulty using conversation analysis studies. And she talks about the fact that women are told, just say no if you don't want it. But the reality is that being a woman in the world is being someone who's going to be very harshly punished if you ask them something and they say no. I mean, Professor Mahmoudi probably had this experience even more than me, but if you're a woman in a position of power and you say, no, we're not going to do that, or no, I'm not going to do whatever you ask from me, people get very mad. But then if you say, well, it's very nice of you to ask me, I actually would love to do this for you, but it happens that it's a bit difficult, then most people say, okay, so you're doing it? And so we need to understand how all of this shapes our ability to express our subjectivity, and that it's not, no matter how much yoga, self-defense, whatever we're going to do, it's only a social change of a big importance that will allow women to not experience the world as men's world, but as our world in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Garcia. This is a very difficult topic, as you already have sensed, but it's a very important topic because I think, as you were saying towards the end, it requires a major change, a major transformation, and I think that's where radical feminism, in a sense, comes in, where we have to rethink all of our ways of living, our institutions, the whole area of global governance and how women are impacted. Anyway, it's a very important topic, and thank you for covering it so well and with such good examples for us. We'll now open it up to questions, and we do have a number of folks online. And I don't know, someone here, maybe let's start with this, with people who have showed up today. Yes, would you, Malik? Oh.
Thank you for your talk, and how neat it is to have a philosopher in the house. So I'll limit my questions to 6. No, just kidding. But I wanted to ask you about sort of ontologies of sort of identity, in a sense. So if one can, and sort of as a category of woman, of womanhood. So thinking of that sort of as a precursor, so that there was a few years ago, there was an uproar. There was a woman who said that she was African American, and people were sort of offended by that. And so people sort of, yes. Yeah. So people sort of countered and said, well, if you can sort of, a person should be able to be what a person is. And so I guess what I'm asking is, when it comes to sort of who is able to share in the burdens of different kind of, I won't say protected classes, but to share in the difficulties of groups of people, how in this modern world, in this modern moment, how does one sort of guide their way through that conversation? What does that look like even from a philosophy? Even before we get into the sort of the modern stage and the back and forth, but just from a philosophy perspective, how do you sort of shepherd intellectual proceeds that go down that way?
Good luck to me. That's a good question. Thank you. No, but so I think I'm going to respond without responding, but I think one weakness of this talk is that, as I said at the beginning, it's actually much more complicated than that. And that it's men's world, but also white people's world, rich people's world, able people's world. And I think the big problem is that in order to see this, you need people whose world it's not to tell you that you don't see that it's your world. And at the same time, there's something really unjust in having to do this work of making people aware of their dominance. My hypothesis, and I'm in that way following Beauvoir, she wrote a very interesting text on privilege. My idea is that privileged people can try to give power to the voices of less privileged people. And that, of course, like I wrote this book about women's submission, and a lot of people told me, look at Beyonce, look at Kamala Harris, the time of women's submission is over. The reality is that in my small village in the south of France, in the family of my husband, who's the son of Turkish immigrants in Germany, in rural America, women's submission is not over. And so I think when we're just high enough that we have access to a voice, we have a moral responsibility to echo the experiences of people who have less of an access to a voice. The problem is that you're probably familiar with this, and if not, it's totally okay because it's an extremely painful text to read, but there's this text from Beatrice Spivak called Can the Subaltern Speak?, where she shows how, in so doing, we impose our ways of looking at these people, on these people. And so that creates a lot of sources of injustice because you're tempted to read their experience through your own experience and your own model of life. So I don't have a response. No, but like, yeah, I don't know.
I think we have questions from online.
We do. I'm going to start with one from Neda Moayed. Listening to you talk about your thought process before leaving for the US is shared by most of us. I shed tears listening to you, a brilliant scholar, sharing concerns. Based on the literature you have reviewed, how can we raise our sons and daughters to reframe their gender roles for a more egalitarian family life?
I ask myself that every day. I think the best, most efficient way is by modeling it. Children are great imitators. My 3-year-old the other day took my phone and said, no, I'm sorry, I need to work right now. I'm sorry, I need to work. I don't have time for this. I need to work. And so she was so clearly imitating me. But so she thinks that, so she has all these things where she's like, no, Maman can't. She needs to travel for work right now. And you know, and Papa is staying at home and, well, not cooking for her, but dressing her up, changing her diapers, giving her bath, doing all of this daily life. So I think children integrate what they see. So the best way to raise our kids to be better than us is to incentivize our husbands to be better if we are in a straight marriage, and incentivize ourselves, because I'm joking about the husbands, but in my case, my husband is the first person to tell me when I say, well, actually, the talk in Maryland, I'm going to do online. He says, well, do you see how you're submitting to gender roles? Like, if it were me, you would, of course, take care of the kids while I go give a talk. So you need to step out of the gender roles and just do what you want to do for your work. So, yeah, I think it's yeah.
Okay, that follows on to the next question, I think. How can we change the subject-object perceptions that are so prevalent in a male-dominated society?
So I think the problem is not the subject-object, it's the fact that the subject-object is stabilized and petrified. I think, and a good example of that is when you think about sex. I hope it doesn't make people uncomfortable, but in general, I think it's good to talk about sex because it's a very important part of our experiences and of our lives. And we need to be able to have the vocabulary and the words to talk about it. When you have sex with someone, there are moments where you treat them as objects, but as objects for your pleasure, for your desire, etc. But that's okay, as long as they can treat you as objects, as it's not you who are 100% of the time a subject and them who are only an object. If you see, oh yeah, I'm using him or her or them now, they're using me, they're taking pleasure from me, and together we're taking pleasure from each other. So the problem is not the subject-object, it's inevitable that we're in a way, self-centered, because we see the world, we experience the world in first person, but there is a way in which we can look at others not as third persons, but as second persons. So as persons to whom we talk, with whom we exchange, whom we think about how they see us. So this is what changes, not just to recognize that there are other subjects than ourselves.
Thank you. I have one comment I'm going to read and then another question. So the comment is from Nagma Shadabi. She doesn't have a question, but she is a girl from Iran, and she just wanted to say thank you for choosing this complicated topic at this time. And then I'll follow up with the question. So the question is from Tiffany Razavi. She says, thank you for an insightful and thought-provoking presentation, and she's sorry she could not be here in person. She really enjoyed your book, and thank you for writing it. She is especially interested in the moral dimension of equality. In particular, it seems that an orientation towards caring and self-sacrifice for the benefit of others creates moral dilemmas for women. What are your thoughts about how the patriarchy shapes women's sense of self, of what is right and what is good, and how can awareness of these issues help both women and men to contribute to building a future society in which both women and men can flourish? She knows this is a big question, but would love to hear what you think.
I think the core word in this question is self-sacrifice. Is that a way out of patriarchy, or a sign that we're making progress out of patriarchy, is to not think of our bonds with others as sacrifices, but as altruism. So of course in a way, there are two questions. The first question is, why is it that we live in a world where altruism is seen as weak? And this is living in men's world that, like, we're told the right way to behave is the homo economicus, is to be selfish and is to want to maximize your own utility, etc. So there's this shift that needs to be done, and that's why I think it's important to remind people that feminism is not wanting for women what men have, is also changing our values and recognizing that intersubjectivity is more important than selfishness. But then it's also thinking about where we think about our duties and our flourishing. I think in an ideal situation and in an ideal life, taking care of one's kids should be something that is not a sacrifice, although sometimes it's really annoying. Because that's the thing that is very difficult, is to recognize that there are things in life that need to be done and that are not always very interesting. Changing diapers is not very interesting. I don't know if you vacuum, but vacuuming is not very interesting. It needs to be done. And the question is, how do we organize society so that vacuuming is not always done by the same people, and not that we externalize it so that we can be rich and never vacuum. I don't know if that really fully responds to the question asked, but I think if women's flourishing were to be respected as a human quest, like it is, then women would not need to sacrifice themselves. And I think women feel like it's a sacrifice because they have no other option. One of the reasons why I work on what I work is my grandmother, who's the typical Mediterranean grandmother, like she has these cupboards filled with sheets that are perfectly ironed in order of colors, etc. The amount of work she's always, well, now she's getting very old, but she was always cooking, cleaning, etc. But the problem with all of that is that she resented it because that's not the life she wanted. I think some people are happy with that, but you need to have choices. The solution is A, to have choices, and B, the architecture of the choices that are open to you. Because if the choice that you have is, I don't know, like being an oppressed housewife or working in a factory plucking frozen chickens so that your hands will be destroyed and you're not even making minimum wage, it's not a choice that you have. The question is, what do we do so that people have choices that are shaped in such a way that they can flourish?
Okay. Let me come back up. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Traveling this distance, even with the 2 young children that you left at home. And I think, in a sense, like you said, this is probably an example for them to see what women can be. And to just express our gratitude, this is a small gift for you. Thank you so
very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And is there a slide for the next? I just want to share our next event, if I may. And we wish you safe travels and enjoy your stay in the States.
Thank you very much.
I just want to tell our audience that, first of all, thank them for joining us today, and to tell you about our upcoming event, which is Professor Ingrid Robben from Ulrich University in the Netherlands. She's going to talk about, in this world of fire, what can libertarianism bring us? I think it'll be a very interesting topic, given the situation that we face in this world today, especially in relation to inequalities and in relation to the climate crisis. The date is October 18 at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so we hope you will join us and register for our next event. Thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.